Welcome back, everybody. This is lecture 23 on the Romanesque artwork of Italy, Normandy, and England. Normandy, of course, is essentially the coast of France opposite what is now the United Kingdom. So we certainly will see some interplay between these two lands. We're now going to take a look at primarily some architectural examples, but also some pretty interesting work in fabric as well. So some interesting things to look at here. Starting in Italy, I just wanted us to get familiar with a kind of Italian tradition for the construction of cathedrals. And cathedrals in Italy, not all of them by any means, but there are several notable examples, have often separate buildings to create a complex of structures. The cathedral obviously is one of the main features. Standing in front of the cathedral, facing the west end, can be found the Baptistery building, and this is actually a building specifically for baptismal ceremonies, and they are freestanding structures in their own right. Often there's also a tower. This is Pisa, of course, the famous leaning tower. The tower there is actually a bell tower, so the church bells are rung from that height. It's known as a campanile. So this cathedral complex in Pisa in Italy, the cathedral is actually the oldest section, begun around the year 1063, and the Baptistery building is later around 1153, then the Campanile another couple decades after this. The Pisa Cathedral is the seat of the Archbishop. It is dedicated to the Assumption of the Virgin, and you can actually see that the cathedral itself has undergone some changes, and that's pretty typical as we move through the Gothic. A lot of the Gothic cathedrals will be built on top of sites of Romanesque cathedrals, so you'll see that as we go forward. In this redesign, this church originally was in a Greek cross, so all four arms, so to speak, were equal in length, and you can see here that that descending arm toward the westward, toward the entrance, has been elongated. You can definitely see Romanesque style in Italy, in Florence in particular. Now, in this particular case, the baptistry predates both the cathedral and the campanile. The campanile, or bell tower, in fact, could almost be referred to as proto-Renaissance. Elements of even the dome on the cathedral could also be considered proto-Renaissance. But we're going to take a look first at the baptistry building, the Baptistery of San Giovanni, or John the Baptist, and that's the building that you're seeing here. It is an octagonal structure. It has a multitude of different colors and textures of marble, both inside and out. So it is somewhat reminiscent, in fact, of the Pantheon in Rome. One of the more interesting features, though, of this particular building is the interior decoration, which is mosaic. So it continues that extreme use of gold in the background, but also picks up on a theme that we've seen in a lot of the church decoration for the Romanesque style, which focuses quite heavily on Christ in judgment, Christ in the second coming. So I want to just call your attention to this section. You can see the largest element in the mosaic is the figure of Christ on the throne, and you can only see part of him here. He equates to this portion of the diagram here. So the largest elements, the most important elements of the design, really are about the Last Judgment, but there are additional images throughout here, including stories from the book of Genesis, the story of Joseph and of Mary, and birth of Christ. So you see a lot of stories being told within this. I just want to show you a panoramic view of the interior just so you get a sense of what that looks like. So if you bear with me, let me switch over here. All right, this should let us now enter the Baptistery in Florence. So here you can see the Last Judgment section, and you can really see the structure of the saved souls being carried up to heaven, and you can see kind of architectural references there, and you can see the tormenting of the damned here in this section, visually to our right, but from Christ's point of view to his left. You can see angels surrounding. Pretty remarkable mosaic work. So a huge influence, the work in this building, huge influence on the beginnings of the Renaissance. So I just want us to be really aware of this example as we go forward. It definitely is a building that we want to remember, and an art style that we want to remember. You can see here that kind of polychrome marble being used on the interior. It does have a little bit of reminiscence to the structure of the Pantheon in a kind of smaller scale and obviously Christian way. The building itself is also notable for the three main entrances. The main entrance, of course, is the entrance that faces the cathedral itself, and there are entrances on the north and south sides as well. We'll look at the development of the decorations of those doors as we go forward. Okay, back to the lecture format. Just so that we can see some of the other examples of Romanesque architecture, always recognizable, of course, because of the round arches. You can see the Italian style is more decorative, especially, I think, on the exteriors in terms of patterning and color in the stone. This is another church in Florence, so we're roughly halfway through the 1000s at this point. It's the year 1062 when this building is completed. And you can see again that the building itself is relatively simple in terms of the division into side aisles, central nave. The clerestory, you can see, allows some light in here. It's a very simple two-part elevation, and you can see the timber roof that's being used. But unlike some of the other churches that we saw in other cultures, we can really see that use of patterned stonework as very important in the Italian style. The Italians will also, of course, be working in fresco, and that will continue into the Gothic era and into the Renaissance. These are some frescoes I wanted you to see from Capua. These are the entombment images of Christ. So on the interior of this chapel, you can see the enormous amount of painting that is still in existence. A lot of it is pretty heavily damaged. But you can see that there are some persistent things that we've come to recognize. We've got mandolas around primary figures like Christ. We have sort of repetitions of figures that look a lot like the Justinian and Theodora mosaic style, but you can clearly see this more elaborate emotional expression that we were noticing really in the Eastern Byzantine is very much coming through in the Italian style, and it's going to be a big influence as we move into the Renaissance. So you see that in a lot of apse frescoes. There are certain aspects, of course, that still feel a little bit false to us. The figures don't seem to have absolutely believable drapery over anatomically correct figures, but we're starting to recognize certain themes here again and again. Mary on the throne of heaven is an important theme for us, presenting the Christ child. The throne represents her in the role of being a wise woman. It shows her on a throne of wisdom, and we often see her, of course, in blue robes, and that will continue throughout the Renaissance as well. We definitely have carving in Italian tradition, somewhat similar, I think, to the proportions that we saw in the doors to the Hildesheim Church. So you can certainly see that there's a bit of a connection to some other cultures here, but more of prominent use of nudity. Of course, in this case, we're looking at the stories of Adam and Eve, but this particular creation story is being presented in a slightly more fully three-dimensional form. The figures almost feel like they're spinning out of that space than in some of the cultures we've studied up till now. And that's just going to continue as we look at Italian sculpture beginning to develop. We're starting to see what feels like fully realized three-dimensional figures that also seem to exist as believable bodies inside of the robes and the drapery that surrounds them. So we're getting closer, I think, to reviving the art, the lost kind of traditions of classical Greek and Roman sculpture. Certainly you can see that here in the Parma Baptistery. You can see that the figures do have an odd combination of symbolic elements, those sort of gigantic heads so we can recognize facial expressions, kind of exaggerated hand gestures, but the knees on the enthroned Christ figure here definitely appear to be pointing toward us in space. There's a little more believable three-dimensionality there. This is the interior of the Parma Baptistery. So you can see that the circular central plan is very much part of the baptistry design. The design also includes these remarkable relief sculptures that represent the months of the year. So there's still a connection, I think, in the Italian tradition between the Catholic liturgy and to people's daily lives and to representing images that people would be able to recognize whether they were literate or not. Moving to England, we want to remember that the British Isles are a kind of complicated historical location to begin with. We have, of course, native peoples who were there from the get-go. We have the Roman invasion, and then the Romans are gone by the 5th century. The power vacuum that creates is filled by invaders. We have people coming from what is now present-day Denmark and present-day Germany. The Angles and the Saxons established colonies within the British Isles themselves. So we definitely have a mixture of cultures and always a tension between those Germanic Franks who settled what is now the coast, Normandy. The Norman Franks are definitely now looking to expand their territory, and that's going to happen under William of Normandy, under a duke who had been, in his own opinion, he had been promised the throne of England. The king, King Edward, was childless, and he had no direct heir to give the throne to, so he promised it to an earl, but William of Normandy claimed that he had also promised it to him, and so a war broke out, and William of Normandy was successful in taking over the British Isles, and so we have a Franco king established as the King of England. Definitely remember that the archetype we're looking at when we're looking at cathedrals comes from the peripteral Greek temple, which turned into the basilica by moving the columns separating the side aisles from the nave to the interior and adding the apses, and then reorienting the building, removing an apse, and putting the entrance back on the short side, adding the transept or the transverse aisle creates that cross shape that really brings us to the cathedral structure that we're accustomed to. We also, of course, want to remember the way of telling the sections of the church interior apart. If you're in the nave, instead of facing the altar and you're facing the side aisles, the division on the wall that separates the decorative sections and the functional sections of the architecture of the cathedral begins at the bottom with a nave arcade. That's just the arches and columns that separate the side aisle from the nave, and then we have changes above that level. You could have as many as 4 of these pieces. The gallery would be a second story that people could actually stand in and look through the openings down into the nave. A decorative area that looks like repeated columns against a blank wall is the triforium, and then the area where the windows are is the clerestory. You can kind of see in this diagram that the taller we get and the higher the level of the height of the church, the issue of supporting such height means the addition of these elements on the outside are flying buttresses. And so the taller that the church gets, the more buttressing we need out to the ground. especially if we have more than one side aisle, we also have additional levels of aisles at the ground. So no light is making it into the nave from the ground level. The light is coming in from the clerestory above. We definitely want to pay attention in the Romanesque, late Romanesque, and into the Gothic with this concept of the vaulting, the system for decoration and establishing the architectural structure of the ceiling of the interior space. We're accustomed to that round barrel vault. We've seen that all the way back through ancient Rome, but we're now seeing the creation of groin vaulting when we have two perpendicular barrel vaults intersecting. So in this case, we have some ribbing, some stone that has been added to this element to not only strengthen that support, but to also give it a visual decorative feeling. When the rib goes across like this from corner to corner, that's a diagonal rib. This set of ribbing that goes straight across the nave would be called a transverse rib. And so the ribbing helps you to denote the divisions in these sections. You can see here this is a 4-part vaulting system, or quadripartite vaulting. This is a 6-part, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And so you can have even higher than that. You can have 7-part vaulting as well, and we'll see some examples of that. So in the Romanesque, our nave elevation is usually 2 or 3 levels. Sometimes it's just the arcade and the clerestory. Sometimes it's just the arcade and the triforium with no windows. But sometimes it's all 3, arcade, triforium, and clerestory. Sometimes in place of the triforium, you could have a gallery. The diagonal and transverse rib system we've looked at already, but I want to just give that to you from a different angle. Instead of looking up at it from below, let's look down at it from the top. Here's a transverse rib, and this would be a diagonal going from this corner to the opposite corner. You can see that happening here. Transverse straight across the bay, and from corner to corner on a diagonal, of course, is our diagonal ribbing. So those pointed ribs are going to become more and more prominent as we get into the Gothic, and they'll help us to raise the height of the roof even a little bit higher. So the ribbed vault would be a vaulting system in which we have projecting stone or masonry work along the divisions. The web is the masonry or stonework that fills in between them. The tribune gallery is one of the features that can appear or disappear, as is the triforium. As we move forward, the clerestory, it will be one of the elements that is pretty consistent in most of the churches that we'll be looking at. We've looked at gallery, the ribbed vaults, diagonals, transverse. We've looked at the webbing. 6-part would be sexpartite. There are 7-part vaulting systems in some churches. We'll see that specifically at Durham Cathedral in England. This is Saint-Etienne in France. It is a church that's dedicated to Saint Stephen, and at this point, this area, this is the northern coastal area of France, this is the heart of Normandy, and so in fact, this is where William the Conqueror is going to be interred. So we can see the Norman style that's going to make its way in England is pretty derivative in some respects of some of the things we saw in Carolingian and Ottonian, which makes sense, right? At the time that Charlemagne founded the Carolingian dynasty, he had control of most of France, Germany, and other parts in Europe. So there's a logic to the fact that the Norman Romanesque style would look a little bit like what we saw in Carolingian, which makes it look kind of like a castle on the front. We don't have a lot of elaborate sculpture in this case, and it very much is an imposing tower-like front. Definitely, though, the interior begins to change. We can really see a 3-part elevation happening here. You've got your nave arcade, you have your gallery, and then the clerestory windows. You can clearly see light coming in from above, and you can definitely see ribbed vaulting taking place here. Now, in this case, the ribbing actually crosses over 2 bays. So if you look at this transverse arch here and follow it down to this column of support, one section, two, three, four, five, six. That brings us to the next transverse area. But you see it has two openings in the gallery. So this is a six-part vaulting that crosses two bays. It unifies the space in a more efficient way. It allows us to raise the height of the church a little bit, but it also draws our eye up vertically and expands in its width. We know that this end of the church was heavily edited, altered, and rebuilt, remodeled later. So the church begins in the true Romanesque style, and then you can see the beginnings of a Gothic style beginning to happen at the choir end or the apse end of the church. Moving across to England, we are now in Durham. So this is a great example of how some of the design ideas from the Norman style are making their way into England. You can see ribbed vaulting taking place here quite easily. The cathedrals in England are much different than in any other country. They are often physically attached to a multitude of other buildings, including this exterior cloister that you can see here. It's also not unusual for the church to not emphasize the height so much in the nave as in the towers at the westwork and at the crossing. That's a fairly British style as well. One of the things that we'll see here, this particular church is dedicated to Mary and to St. Cuthbert. Cuthbert was in fact a monk at Lindisfarne. So if you go all the way back to our Hiberno-Saxon, the style that is the influence of the Irish monks in England, you can see that these are the roots of the religion here in England. And so Cuthbert was already beatified. After his death, his relics were held at Lindisfarne, and then as more Viking incursions began to happen, the monks decided that they had to flee and they wanted to protect their books and the relics of St. Cuthbert. And so the relics of St. Cuthbert made their way here to Durham Cathedral. It's hard to see in this image, but this cathedral is actually set up on a bend in a river, and so it's a naturally kind of fortified space, a protected space. And the very first thing that the monks did when they found the site was to create a small shrine for the relics, and then the cathedral was built after that. You can also see a pretty British tradition here in this incredible amount of decoration. The piers themselves that support the vaulting over the nave in particular alternate between large columns and then what we call compound piers that look like multiple smaller columns put together. And those compound piers are attached to where we have the transverse arches going across the vaulting. But what's also really interesting is that these large compound piers have a heavy amount of carving in them, and that carving was accentuated with paint, and they actually alternate in style. So we have fluted columns closer to the entrance than these kind of chevron or diagonal shapes that you see in this photograph. We also have lozenge shapes here, and then even more decorative columns that begin to look twisted, which are an imitation of columns in St. Cathedral in Rome. So some distinguishing features to look out for. This is one of the churches to know for the test. So you're looking for a large tower at the crossing. You're looking for a relatively complex set of nave vaulting. This is the church that has the 7-part vaulting system, and that 7-part vaulting covers 2 bays. Patterned pillars which alternate between the large pillar and the compound pier, and of course mostly rounded arches. You can see the 7-part vaulting in this diagram right here. So it's not in every single bay, it's in the 3 bays that lead us to the crossing. So if you count here, the bay of course is a space between 2 columns. So really that's 1 bay and that's 2. So the way this is designed, because of these diagonals, here and here, these diagonal ribbed vaults, divides that vaulting system into 1, 2, 3, big diamond in the centers, 4, 5, 6, 7 parts. You can definitely see the three-part elevation that's happening here, which gives us our nave arcade, our gallery, and then a clerestory. And then check out the decorative quality of these columns. You can really see the alternation happening here, and you can see our kind of honeycomb shape, the zigzag, and the fluted column in those big three sections along that main part of the nave. Here's the twisted columns that are somewhat in imitation of St. Peter's. So this kind of emphasis on pattern and decoration, you're going to see it is very different in England from other cultures that we'll look at. And definitely the British continue the tradition of the illuminated manuscripts, and for the most part those are continuing most traditions that we've seen up until this point. This is kind of an interesting one, though, in which the main character on this folio page is, of course, Moses, and it looks like he's got horns. There is actually a translation of the original text that makes the there's a very close similarity between the word horned and the word for shone or shined with light. If you look at a contemporary Bible after Moses receives the laws and he comes down from the mountain after meeting directly with God, his face radiates or shines with light, and that was translated as horned by some early translators. And a lot of images of Moses after receiving the tablets with these horns. We also see a continuation of reminding us of the perils of sin. It's not at all unusual to see this image of the hell mouth, literally the mouth of hell opening up to swallow the damned. And you can certainly see how the emphasis on those swirly lines and the decorative quality has really overwhelmed the believability of the human anatomy underneath that figure. One of the most remarkable examples to look at and to know for the test is a pretty unique object. It is known as the Bayeux Tapestry. It was originally commissioned by Bishop Odo in support of William of Normandy. So this is an example of telling a historical story through pictures. It's somewhat reminiscent of the hieroglyphs that we saw in Egypt. It also reminds me quite a bit of the column of Trajan, although it doesn't spiral upward. It is a long piece of linen in which the imagery is stitched onto it. It's embroidered. So we call it a tapestry, but truly it is an embroidery. And it tells the story of the Norman conquest. The piece to key in on, because the object is enormous, the piece to key in on is the height of the battle here. This is the Battle of Hastings, the decisive battle at which William defeats Harold, who was the other claimant to the throne, and is able to install himself as the rightful king of England. One of the remarkable things about it is the dynamism of these horses. I mean, the way they're even falling, it looks like breaking necks. You can also see that the figures of the soldiers are pretty dynamic, and we also have these figures of the dead below that are pretty remarkable. So I included a video that is basically walks you through the entirety of the Bayeux Tapestry. It is a video of a reconstruction, so it is not the absolute original, but it has all original scenes reproduced in it. So it tells you the entire story. I'm just going to give you a handful of highlights. This is the funeral procession for Edward. Edward the Confessor was the king. He dies without heir, and that kind of sets the stage for this big conflict. You can see God the Father kind of blessing the church as the body is carried to Westminster for interment. There are only 3 female figures in the entire Bayeux Tapestry, and it's an enormously long object. And there's also some unusual pieces that we don't know exactly what they mean, and this is one of them. The woman that you see here may be actually a relative of the royal family. She may be a nun. We're not sure what the interaction is between these two characters, but this inclusion of a nude male figure, genitals exposed figure, really leads kind of a sexual connotation to this. We're not sure exactly what the meaning of that section is. We do know that once William of Normandy decides that he is going to take action, military action, the Bayeux tapestry really starts to come to life, and you see the chopping down of trees. The trees do look a little strange. This is what one of the trees looks like. And then you see craftsmen building these long ships, kind of in the Viking tradition. And then you see them even putting horses onto the ships. You may not be able to tell other than here. Can you see the heads of the horses? They actually have put all of their military troops, including their horses, their armor, spears, caskets of wine, and they take off on the sea. Then there's a omen that is witnessed. You see Harold, who has assumed the throne of England, and you see this odd object flying by. This is actually the first recorded image in art of Halley's Comet, and it was believed to be an ill omen for Harold, and in fact he dies in trying to maintain his throne. Once the troops of William the Conqueror arrive in England, they stop to feast. You can see them here eating roast birds, chickens maybe, drinking wine. They are being blessed by Bishop Odo, and then they go to battle. And you can see the bishop taking place in the battle. That's him with this huge mace. So they lead from this scene directly into the one to recognize for the test, which is that dramatic battle scene. The stitches for the way that this is put together, again, remember, it's not true tapestry. There's a linen fabric that's woven first, and then the scenes are embroidered or stitched onto it. The outlining stitch is known as stem stitching, and the fill-in that does the color is known as laid and couch work.